It's no surprise that I often get asked about careers in aviation. Like, all the time, right? Remember the last episode? And of course, don't get me wrong, I love it. I mean, I really love it. Aviation mentorship, well, it's an actual service that I provide. But nearly every time I get asked about aviation careers, it's usually a pilot track individual, or sometimes it's a controller track individual, and every once in a while, it's even about the maintenance and engineering side of things too. And don't worry, we're actually going to get to that in a minute. But if a 25-year career in aviation has taught me nothing else, it's don't limit yourself to just one thing. There's just so much opportunity out there, and it's pretty much just sitting there for the taking if you're prepared. Oh, and even more importantly, never, ever, 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 ever get caught without a backup. If you've been listening to this podcast for any length of time, you'll know that I've had a bunch of different jobs in the industry, and there's nothing wrong with that. Actually, there's a lot right with that, and that's the point. And I'm not the only one. I mean, we've talked on the show before with RH over at Opposing Bases, and his career track followed a similar track to mine. And I ran into a guy who works at another tower in the area who also worked at another regional, flying the Dash 8, and he decided to cross over to ATC too. No podcast from him, though. And we've done even a couple episodes on starting out your career in line service at an FBO. So as far as I'm concerned, doing as many things as you can in whatever industry you're in is probably a good idea, both for the upward mobility experience and also in case the bottom falls out when you least expect it. Like, what if you lose your medical? What if your company goes out of business? What if you don't get that job you were banking on? Or what if you did, but then you find out it isn't as great as you thought it'd be? And what if you're a pilot or a controller and you're inevitably forced to retire, but you still have a lot to give? Well, maybe you'll need to use your imagination. That's the name of the song, by the way. So today, side hustles, career changes, pivots, and alternates. I don't know anyone whose career hasn't had a few of them, and that's why I want to give you some actionable content today that might help move your career along, or maybe even catch you if the bottom does fall out without warning you first. Don't go away. This is an email from show supporter and former pro pilot, Sean Thurman. He says, "Hi, Brandon. I'm the pilot and owner of Baron 1 Papa Zulu that you mentioned on your last podcast. I was practicing approaches at your airport, and I thought I'd give you a shout out. Your colleagues were doing a great job accommodating me. And by the way, I try to do them when it's not too busy, usually earlier in the morning or in the evening after your traffic dies down. Keep up the great work on the podcast. It's really beneficial for pilots to hear what controllers face on a daily basis and to get a little insight into your job. It makes the whole system work better, and it creates a bond between us. After all, we both love aviation. I got all my ratings through CFII in 1997 at Montgomery Field. I taught there for a while, and then I was hired with American Eagle to fly the regional jet. 9/11 hit shortly thereafter, and they laid us all off. I was lucky to get another job with SkyWest flying the Brasilia, which is a great plane for its mission. In fact, I used to fly the Brasilia into your airport every day. However, I knew the airline industry was going to need at least 10 years to recover. I wasn't willing to be gone 4 days a week, to fly 8 legs a day, and to work every weekend, holiday, etc. for the next decade. The regionals were supposed to be a stepping stone to the majors, not a permanent place for any length of time. I left SkyWest for a job as a police officer for a local PD. I worked as a police officer for many years, and then started a polygraph company. The company's been so successful that I decided to purchase an airplane to service clients out of our county. Last spring, I purchased my first ever airplane, a 1973 E-55 Baron, 1 Papa Zulu. I forgot how much I loved flying and airplanes in general. Now I'm living the dream. I'm my own boss, no more working nights and weekends, and I have my own Baron that I can fly whenever and wherever I want. I keep it at Brownfield. Great job and keep up with the podcast. Take care, Sean." Well, that pretty much sums it up. It's amazing the turns that life can take, and even though it might not have been his original plan, sometimes what ends up happening, well, it's better than you could ever imagine. And who knows, maybe it's even the original thing you wished you were doing. It just depends on you. But if it's a pilot job you're wanting, well, now's still a great time. I also got an email a few weeks ago from a guy named Dallas, and he's been keeping with the theme of feedback from people with really cool names. Anyway, he says, "Hey Brandon, just wanted to introduce myself and ask you a couple questions. My name is Dallas and I'm 23 years old, and I've been in aviation for a few years now. My grandfather's a person I give credit to for sparking my interest in aviation. He was the general manager of Seawind, and his whole life was aviation. I started flight lessons on my 16th birthday with every intention to become an airline pilot. Reality hit shortly after, and I realized that having to drive an hour and 15 minutes to the airport each time I wanted a flight lesson, on top of the cost of the lessons, was not practical for me at the time. I was only making enough money for one lesson a month. And as I'm sure you're aware, one lesson a month just isn't going to cut it for someone trying to get their pilot's license. The cost of acquiring all my ratings and licenses on top of the schedule airline pilots have made me realize that maybe that life wasn't for me. But since I loved aviation so much, I still wanted it to be a huge part of my life. So after I turned 18, I decided to go to A&P school. What better career to still be able to be around all those airplanes and not have to get all those ratings? The school I attended has a year-long program. One of the things I had to give up while at school was flight lessons. And though I had stopped flying for a bit, it was still my dream to at least get my private pilot's license and own my own plane. So I graduated with my A&P at 19 years old and was ready to enter the aviation industry. I got my first job with a mid-sized Part 135 that operates Cessna 402s. As a matter of fact, I believe they're the world's largest operator of the 402 with 90-some in their fleet. After working there for a year and a half, I got hired on with a regional carrier for a big airline. Anyway, I've been there the past 2.5 years and have been learning a lot and enjoying it. My goal is to hopefully soon move up to mainline and get to work on the wide bodies. This past spring, I had the opportunity to start up my flight training again and finish my private pilot's license. After 3 short months, I studied up and passed all my tests, and since then I've had a blast flying. I recently just purchased a Cessna 150 that I plan on fixing up and reselling. The nice thing is that it's a flyable project, so I can get to enjoy flying it while working on it. I've always been interested in ATC, and when I'm sitting in the planes at work, I always listen to a busier frequency-like approach to try and learn and become a better pilot. For a while now, I've had a desire to pursue a career in the ATC side of aviation. So here come the questions I have for you. How would I go about getting my foot into the door for a career in ATC? Does being a pilot and having a few years' experience as a mechanic help my chances of getting selected at all? My main fear is that leaving the maintenance side and the good job that I have now to start a career in ATC only to have it not work out. Listening to some of the guys who went through the academy only to later not make it at a facility makes me second-guess myself. What are your thoughts on the matter? I've always had a great deal of respect for the controllers, and there's always been a part of me that wants to be on that side of the mic. I appreciate all the information you pass on to us listeners. So cool to see other people's passion for aviation, and I'm still amazed how small a community the aviation industry is. Thanks for all you do and for all the time you put into making each episode. I eagerly await each of your episodes each month. Keep up the good work and fly safe. Regards, Dallas Marshall. Well, I think Dallas's question is one that a lot of people have, and maybe you do too. Maybe you're thinking, hey, life's pretty decent doing what I do now, but I might have a passion for something else. But it's a risk. So first off, let's answer his questions. How would I go about getting my foot in the door for a career in ATC? Well, that's a really good question, and I really don't have one answer. But anytime you want to get your foot in the door in any industry, you need to go out and start networking. You need to meet people. And you can meet a lot of controllers. I mean, who knows? Maybe some of them do podcasts, right? But you can meet some controllers. You can meet some people at your local facility, get some tours, start handing out cards, start shaking hands, meet the people that make the decisions. And as being a pilot and having a few years' experience as a mechanic help my chances of getting selected at all? Well, I wish I knew the answer to that. And again, unfortunately, I don't, because those decisions are made by HR and they're made in a way that I feel like probably changes over time. I mean, it depends on how many people want in and what their needs are at the time for them. I think it does help. I know when you transfer from one facility to another, or you try to apply for a promotion or something like that, there is a point system that involves certificates and ratings. Each one's worth, I think, 1 point. So it's not a huge help, but it does help a little. Does it help you get selected in the first place? I really wish I knew. And if anybody listening out there has some knowledge about this, let's write into the show, and I'd be really curious to know how that goes too. But I'll tell you what, once you're in the job, knowing what you know is definitely going to help you a lot. It might make it harder at first when you're training to get your head out of the cockpit, but eventually, especially if an emergency happens or something like that, it'll really help you meet the demands, probably much more easily and comfortably than if you didn't really know what was going on, right? Well, I hope that helps. And I like that he decided to go into the maintenance side of things. And for those looking to get into aviation, maybe not as a pilot or a controller, well, that could be a really good place. I actually have 2 articles here talking about how much actionable opportunity there is on the mechanical side of things right now. Maintenance and engineering folks are often like the unsung heroes. And I'll admit, I didn't know it, but apparently they're hurting for talent too. Bad. This first article is called Progress Being Made on U.S. Mechanic Development, and it's from MROnetwork.com. The title of the article is, While There's Positive Momentum for Filling the Future Aviation Mechanic Workforce Needs, Not All Metrics Are Good. The article says, while there are still challenges to be met, progress is being made in filling the current and future needs for aircraft mechanics in the U.S., according to the latest pipeline report of the Aviation Technician Education Council. Here's the good news first. The majority of maintenance technician schools reporting anticipate the number of 2018 graduates will increase 10% over 2017 and a further 11% in 2019, and they expect total enrollment to increase 40% in 2019. Furthermore, school capacity is no hurdle. Only one half of the seats in technical schools are now taken, so an additional 17,000 students can be readily accommodated. One problem is that a substantial portion of aviation technician school graduates have been seeking non-aviation jobs. The latest report says the number seeking non-aviation jobs is now dropped by nearly half to 13%, and 70% of students are now taking the FAA mechanic exam upon graduation, which is a 10-point increase over the previous 2 years. Of course, not all mechanics have to come from these schools. Of 6,401 mechanics certificated in 2017, 63% obtained certification based on completion of a technician school program, 10% based on military experience, and 27% based on civilian experience. The FAA now counts 293,000 certificated mechanics, of which females make up 2.4%, a portion that has been constant for 15 years. More progress must be made, however. The Council reckons 30% of mechanics are now 60 years of age or older, which is a 3% increase from the prior year, and new mechanics still account for only 2% of the workforce each year. Unless this rate of replacement is increased, the mechanic population will decline 5% over the next 15 years, the Council projects, and the article concludes that productivity improvements can trim some needs, as can outsourcing abroad, but so long as traffic is growing at 2 to 4% annually, it'll be difficult to reconcile the demand with a declining supply of mechanics. And again, that article from MROnetwork.com. And the second article I want to talk about here is actually a white paper done by major MRO player AAR. They're getting really concerned about the future availability of talented individuals to work on airplanes. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, don't worry, but here's the executive summary. The aviation industry's workforce shortage has the potential to constrain companies' future growth, even as demand for air travel soars at unprecedented heights. From pilots to FAA-certificated aircraft mechanics and repairmen to uncertificated aircraft technicians, critical segments of the aviation workforce are retiring faster than new talent is being recruited and upskilled for thousands of open positions. And if you want to read that white paper, the link is in the show notes. And if not, Rob Mark covered it for Flying Magazine, and there's a link to his article right there too. And it starts something like this. Much of the industry has been focused on the 206,000 pilots a recent Boeing report says will be needed in the U.S. over the next 25 years. Not nearly as well publicized, however, is that same study that calls for 189,000 aircraft maintenance technicians by 2045. Well, seems like the getting's pretty good all over the industry right now, huh? Anyway, that article, like I said, was by Rob Mark. Him and I often talk about the next generation of aviation journalists and writers and communicators and how to get people interested in writing, either as a career or maybe just as a part-time freelance thing. But we finally got a chance to record it. And there's a lot more in this talk that you're going to hear about than just writing or even just aviation. So no matter what part of your career you're in, or maybe if you're even looking to do something else, I'm really, really happy to be able to share this talk we had with y'all. All right, Rob. Well, I heard that, in addition to the pilot shortage and the mechanic shortage and I don't know, any other shortage you can think of out there, there's a shortage in another part of aviation, and it's probably one that we all touch, but we don't really think about, and that's aviation journalism. I mean, I read Flying Magazine, I read, AOPA, I read all of them, but I guess we never really think that a need for journalists is actually a pretty big deal. And I know you've got a background in journalism, but you've also got a background in aviation. So how did that all come about?
Well, it's a funny thing, but when I started flying back in the, as my daughter says, back in the 1800s, I remember sitting in the terminal at Midway, waiting for a turn or something, and I just started talking to one of the jet guys. We were talking about how we got where we were and all that, and he said, "So what else do you do?" What do you mean? What else? You mean, what do I do for fun? Or he said, "No, what's your backup?" And I said, "Well, it's funny. I guess I was caught a little off guard because nobody had ever asked me that before." But I said, "Well, I'm trying to be a writer." And he said, "So, what have you done and where have you been?" Anyway, so the point is that in a very short time, we got into this conversation to the point that I realized that he felt the way I do, that if you're in aviation, especially flying, you really need a backup. It's like having an alternate when you're IFR. You don't want to end up somewhere and say, this didn't work out. Now what do I do? And so I've always had something like that going. For me, it started, though, really when I would be on layovers when I was flying charter and even when I was flying for the airlines, we'd have these huge layovers of 2 hours, 3 hours before we went out again, 5 hours, 6 hours. And I was just bored to tears. And I said, I've got to find something to do. Unfortunately, I'm not much of a sports guy. I cannot read the same magazines that have been looked at 50 times in the FBO. And I just started writing just almost out of defense, I think, to cure my boredom. And I think as time went on, I really started to enjoy it. And that's just kind of how it went down. And I think I'm trying to think of where I sold a story. Oh, I think I sold my first story to AOPA Pilot back in, well, we won't say when, but it was a long time ago. And I just had an idea. I sent the editor a letter and said, hey, would you be interested in this? And he said, sure. Yeah, this was back in the old days when they actually sent letters and he signed it. He said, sounds good. When can you get it? Wow, I've got a job to do. And I think it just kind of flowed from there. When I had a break in my life for some life adventures in my mid-30s, I decided to go to graduate school. And that's when I went to graduate school at journalism at Medill Journalism School at Northwestern. It really did change my life, I think, because the first day I still remember the chairman saying, you know what, some of you may learn some of what we're going to teach you here, but what I really care about most is you're going to learn how to think differently. I don't think I really understood what he was saying, but years later I did. And it really, I think when you combine flying with something like that, it opens your horizons to possibilities, because I think too that people think if I'm a pilot, then I have to fly, and that's it. If I'm not flying here, then I must be flying over there, and there's nothing else in your life that's of any importance, and it doesn't have to be like that, but you have to kind of grab the bull by the horns and get it started.
Yeah, well, I mean, as a young person, obviously, you're trying to figure out maybe what your career is going to be, what business you're going to get in, and it's reasonable that you're focused on one thing. I mean, I'd say that somebody who has that much focus, even at a young age, is probably ahead of the game, because there are probably so many that have very little focus. But then again, at the same time, yeah, eventually, I mean, you're going to get to a point where you're a line pilot, you're certified, you're there. That's it. And then you realize how much time you've got. Or then you go through a big economic down cycle, and reality is going to hit you that there might need to be something else, whether it's a backup or just something you do for fun. But I mean, there's going to have to be something else in there other than just go to airport, fly plane, stay in hotel, fly plane back, the end, right?
Oh, absolutely. And when the first Midway shut down, I was already writing maybe a story, a freelance story, once every couple of months for various magazines. But I mean, it wasn't anything big time. But then one day I went to work, and I still remember this. We flew down to Louisville, and we were getting fuel in the airplane, and the ground guy came out and said, "Hey, they're looking for you on the phone." And I went in, and they said, "Well, here's the deal. Have they already fueled the airplane?" And I said, "Yeah." They said, "Okay, bring it home, guys. We're all done." And that was it for the airline. And I said, when we got back later, of course, Midway was there were people in tears all over the terminal, just because Midway Airlines had kind of owned that airport. And now we were just homeless. And we had almost no notice at all. And I said, okay, now what am I going to do? And I just started trying to get some work doing some writing. Not that I was that great a writer then, but I was persistent as all get out. And I think that counted for a lot. I remember a couple of people saying, "It's you again. Okay, look, why don't you do this?" And they weren't angry, just saying, "Okay, I'm going to do something because you're a pest, except that I must like something you're doing or I wouldn't give you anything at all." So I think you need that to be successful at any career, but I don't see absolutely anything at all wrong with having a backup plan. I know there are people that do that think they're not being true to their nature, and I just don't see it that way.
Sure. I want to hear a little bit more about, you mentioned thinking differently. A pilot is going to think maybe one way about something, but a journalist, no, you're going to see the world differently now. So I want to hear a little bit more about that.
I think I've always been a curious person. I don't think I realized it until I really went back to graduate school, and I realized how many questions I wanted to ask that I didn't ask, because I got back in graduate school and instantly I was back in high school again. Do you have the answer? Well, no, I don't. So I didn't raise my hand, and that kind of thing, because I was afraid I was going to be wrong. And this chairman, who actually is still a good friend of mine, actually I'm having lunch with tomorrow after God knows how many years since I finished the graduate program. But he said, no, just say it. Because I guess I must have had a look on my face that I think I know something, but he said, just spit it out. And I really gained an awful lot of confidence in that. It probably sounds like a silly example, but it worked for me. And that has really carried me through much differently than I did before I went to school. And I found that worked in flying too. Situations where your gut says, I don't know, I don't like that route, or something feels strange or whatever. I go with it now, and I go, I spit it out. And it's amazing how often what you say is either correct or someone else will say, I had the same idea. And so I began to realize how much of maybe my own creativity I had been ignoring a good portion of my life. So again, for me, graduate school and meeting people that had in that university setting really turned it really changed the way I looked at life.
Sure. Now, I guess let's get down to business. You're saying there's a shortage of journalists out there right now. What would make somebody want to become a journalist? How would they even become a journalist?
Well, I think what you might be referring to is the fact that I started a list, Google group, I should say, a few month and some ago, just seeing if other editors that I've come to know, other editors and writers that I've come to know over the years, thought the same thing that I did. Are we short of people? Who's going to replace us at flying, or at AOPA Pilot, or at Aviation Week, or Plane and Pilot, or at Reuters that covers aviation, or any of those kinds of outlets, and there are quite a few of them. And I realized that when I sent out that email, and I think we have about, and you're on the same list, I think we have about 70 or 75 writers and editors, and they all said, yeah, we aren't doing anything to encourage new people to come in. People are just kind of winging it at this point. And in this marketplace where there are a lot of talented people that are employed, there are places that can't find talented people to replace the ones that leave. I mean, either they leave or they get frustrated with journalism, but then think of the ones that simply don't know anything about aviation at all.
Yeah, well, that's kind of that's, I guess, in any technical pursuit, that's kind of the part that I feel like the rub lies right there. I mean, I guess you could attack it from one angle, which would be maybe all the people that are going through aviation, maybe administration type programs. Maybe we could throw journalism as like a major alternative. Or then again, you could go the other way, whereas you could go to the journalism school and try to recruit people out of there that like aviation. But I mean, I doubt that you're going to get a whole lot of people in either camp.
Well, no, and that's true. But of course, as our group discussion, I don't know if you saw that, but I think Tom Haynes from AOPA was one of the people that mentioned it, that sure, we're talking about the shortage, but right now there aren't that many jobs in aviation journalism anyway. We have so many aspects of journalism, even online journalism, that are laying people off. I mean, BuzzFeed laid a bunch off a few weeks ago. Huffington Post did. So, again, but just because there's not a ton of jobs right now, it doesn't mean we shouldn't be looking or encouraging, or at least making people that can write or have an interest, making them aware of this option, because it's kind of like the pilot shortage. 5 years ago, you couldn't find a job to save your life they just weren't there. And now, of course, all you need is a pulse, or at least it seems like that to me. So things can change pretty quickly. But as I know, some of the people in the business, many of them are, we're getting pretty ancient there, really. And I don't see a whole lot of really young folks coming in that are any good. And I think that's, again, is it because they don't even know the option exists, or they find aviation not that interesting anymore, or they say, gee, I don't have the technical expertise to write about this. It's, but again, I think we need to start somewhere. And again, I think some of the ideas we've seen on the list has been, go to some of the journalism schools just to give people an opportunity to even hear. But think about that. I mean, I don't know how many dozen journalism schools there are, but getting into one class for a half an hour somewhere, what kind of a return is that going to be? I mean, maybe in a class of 20 people, maybe you might get one person or maybe two that might be interested. So again, that can make for a lot of work. But right now, we're not doing anything, absolutely anything at all. I think it's going to take more than just the 70 or 75 people on our list to figure out where the next generation of communicators are coming from. I think just as the aviation industry learned when the pilot shortage really became acute, as well as the mechanic shortage, I think it's going to take people in the C-suite at the publications to recognize that there's no one there coming up to fill the gaps. And all of us working together might be able to solve it, but it's going to take some kind of concerted effort like that, I think.
Well, what do you think we can do? Because, I mean, think about it this way. Most people, I think, in this generation are going to say, hey, I've got something to say, or I've got a passion for something, and they're going to run right out and they're going to buy a microphone and start a podcast.
That's a very good point, and I'm really sorry you brought that up because I didn't think of that myself. No, it is a good point. And if you listen to some of the podcasts that we've heard just even in the last year, there are a few out there that are really, really good. But they still begin with the basic story. If you don't know how to tell a story and you don't know how to research and write one up in order to make a good podcast even, you end up with something that people go, it's okay. I mean, it's no big deal. My guess is that there are 10 times as many mediocre podcasts out there as there are really riveting ones. But what we're seeing in journalism, and I saw this 30 years ago when I was in grad school, people were saying, there's this thing called the internet, and you're going to be able to share things with people all over the world, audio files and photographs and email, and people said, what? I remember creating basic audio files a long time ago, and people saying, who cares? I don't know. It's a lot of work. And now, if you want to be involved in journalism or telling a story, whether it's the aviation industry or any other, you need to know how to edit audio, how to write scripts, how to tell a good story in writing and on audio. And I think that's certainly eclipsing what we thought was going to happen, that everything was going to be video. Producing a good video show is really hard. I mean, I have tried. I don't think I was successful, but I've tried, and it's really, really hard. And also there's the added element of the fact that any show visually focuses on you and how you look and how you move and just generally how you operate. And that all takes away from the story. And that's why I think podcasting has become such a great alternative, because it doesn't matter what you look like. If you can tell a good story and you can make the electronics work, and then you figure out the distribution part, you can have a really successful show.
So what you're saying is if you have a face for radio, then you're in the right place.
Yes, I think that's true. But you need the skill. See, I mean, when I started writing, all I needed was, in fact, I had a little portable typewriter that I used to take with me on trips, and some of the other folks used to laugh, well, what is that thing? I said, that's my writer's typewriter. Oh, and they would laugh and all that. But on a break, I'd be there with paper and typewriter writing things, so many of which went absolutely nowhere, but sometimes they did. And I've been lucky enough in my career to win a number of awards where people said, yeah, we really like this. In fact, we like this so much, we think it's better than the other ones. And I don't go looking for that, but boy, it sure is nice when that comes along and it makes you realize that I did the right thing many years ago.
Well, so what do you think then about the audio form of media taking over for the written form of media? I mean, do you think that's a thing, or is there always going to be a place for written media?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think I have to be careful about saying, no, that will never happen, because I will start to sound like my father, and he didn't like the Beatles either, and look what happened to them. So, but I think it's important to realize it's certainly going to be both at a minimum. Whether podcasting will completely eliminate the written word, I don't know. It does make me concerned when I see shrinking newspapers and that sort of thing coming along, and magazines that are half the size of what they were 10 years ago. And but of course they're so dependent on advertising that it's just happening. And but podcasting, same way. You can only do it for the love of the show for so long, and maybe a number of likes on your Facebook page or on Twitter, or some healthy comments somewhere else. But again, if you're not making a dime at it ever, after a while you go, what am I doing here? Is there a future here? So where does that take us? Everybody can be a publisher, but not everybody can be a good publisher.
Sure. Well, I mean, what you said right there is, even for myself, your head gets scrambled by, just look in the mirror about 10 years ago. Blogging had gotten really popular, right? So if you had any amount of skill in writing, you could just start a blog, and anybody could start a blog. And 99% of them were probably not that great, but there were a few that were really, really good, and you could subscribe to them, and you had it. But then people realized they could monetize that by putting affiliate links and ads, and you know how it goes. But somebody with no background could actually kind of make a passable living doing that. And some people got really successful, but then, blogging kind of died a few years back. And if you ask me, I'd say it's because YouTube and because podcasting and so on. But at the same time, there's still blogs out there. I publish each episode as a blog post on my website. And I think there's a lot to be said for written media. I mean, I subscribe to Flying Magazine still. I think I've been a subscriber now for, 20 years. I don't read it in paper. I read it on my iPad. But, I still like to sit down and grab a coffee and just sit and read instead of listening to something. I think there is a need for it. But for somebody who's coming up in this right now and they're like, hey, here I am, and I've got this passion for aviation, and I might even have a little bit of skills when it comes to either storytelling or writing. They're going to be faced with a bunch of challenges like, do I start a blog? Do I start a podcast? Do I start a YouTube channel? Do I just say, hey, forget it and go to the airlines? I mean, their brain is going to be just spinning with all these choices. So what's a person like that to do now?
Well, I think that's also a very interesting question, because I think another an option that we're thinking certainly is, well, what about the option to go work at a magazine somewhere, be a staff writer, and people I think are often they're just not even thinking of that. I mean, they might hear one of the aviation outlets producing a podcast saying, I could do that. Yeah. I could work. But as far as storytelling in the written word, I don't know. I'm just not certain that it's really going to work the way that I thought it was. And what you just mentioned here about, will the new aviation communicators essentially be looking at the new media only and saying, well, listen, we really need to do a podcast. I mean, I can do that, and I have some talent, and as opposed to used to be a kind of laborious process of sending a pitch to an editor at a magazine and getting their okay to cover a story, and then writing it up and sending it in, and all that sort of thing. People say, well, what do I need them for? I can tell the story without them, except that what we have that they don't have is that we have the distribution network. I mean, last time I checked on Facebook, even though I know people will roll their eyes at Facebook, I mean, I think there's still almost 350 or 400,000 people hanging out on our Facebook page. So are they waiting for something different to happen? I feel like they are. I'm not sure exactly how we do it, but your point, though, about should we be looking at different places to find journalists other than J School? Should we be looking at encouraging people to use new media to tell stories in a different way on a regular basis? Will that supersede the print magazine? I don't know. I think that's an interesting point you should raise on the list. They're either going to say absolutely nothing, or there could be quite a debate about that.
Sure. Well, let's put it this way. So right now, let's say I'm done with whatever career I'm in. I've got this aviation background or whatever, at least enough to talk about it, right? And I don't mean me specifically. This could be anyone. But I want to write for Flying Magazine. Like, that's been my lifelong dream, is to write for Flying. What would I do right now? I mean, what concrete steps could I actually take to maybe move that forward?
Well, I think before you could write for Flying, you would need to have written most likely somewhere else, unless you were a prodigy that was just hiding in the wings all these years.
Yeah, of course. No, that's what I am.
Yeah, okay. Well, I kind of figured that was right up your alley there. What people will do is say, gee, they don't write very much about this, that, or whatever. They don't write enough about LSA flying, or learning to fly ultralights, or this, that, or whatever. You can find the emails for the editorial staff for the magazines online, and you find one that's about. I almost never go to an editor-in-chief because they're usually too busy for anybody. But I find a mid-range editor, maybe a senior editor, a managing editor, and say, hey, hi, you don't know me, but here's a little bit of my background, and I've got a really cool idea that I think would make a good story for you guys. Are you interested? And then you send it off and you see what happens. But the trick is to explain the story idea the way you would write it. You don't necessarily say, hi, this is Brandon. Do you want a story about the difficulties of flying single pilot without a GPS? I mean, yeah, I don't know. That doesn't tell me very much. It doesn't tell me very much about the story. but it also doesn't give me much of an idea of whether you can tell the story. We have a lot of people that approach us that when it gets down to the, okay, give me another page of something to explain the story and how you would tell that story. And many people don't get that. And if they don't get it, then it's kind of a waste of time. But I'm saying that, you send a letter to an editor and you write it like a story. Did you know that in the world of flying single pilot airplanes that don't have a GPS, there are a lot of tricks you can use to not have to spend the money to buy a GPS or, something like that. And you just go on for a paragraph or so that the editor can say, okay, that's an interesting idea. I like this person. I like the way this person uses language and things like that. And they may say, well, I don't know if that's really the story we want. If they like you, they may say, however, if you looked at it from a different perspective and you wrote about this, I might be interested. And because realize we know the magazine better than a lot of the freelancers that write in. And then you see what happens. It's tough because most people say, I don't want to go through all that work. Oh, man. They're going to say no anyway, so what difference does it make? So, they kind of put themselves behind the 8 ball before they ever begin. I'll just go write a blog. I'll just go start a podcast. And you and I both, you more than me, know how difficult it is to produce a great podcast. It's not simply about telling the story. It's how do you package it so it sounds really engaging. And that's not so easy.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, hey, 2 guys talking into a microphone is, by definition, yeah, it's a podcast, but it's a podcast no one's going to listen to. So
that's right.
It's very difficult. It seems very easy because the barrier to entry is low because that whole process you just described doesn't exist. You just go to a media host, get a microphone, plug it in, record something, and there you go. You have a podcast. But at the same time, it's not going to get you anywhere. Okay, so how about this? I look back around, let's call it 6 years ago, and one of your writers, Sam Weigel, he had his debut article right around then. And I remember reading his first article on my break at down at the Tracon at the time, and it sounded like exactly the same career path I had had. The only difference was he was still at an airline, and I was at an ATC. But other than that, it really resonated with me, and I was like, you know what? A little part of me once upon a time probably would have wanted to have a career like this, but it went a different way. What did he do to get himself a regular column in a prestigious magazine like Flying when the background that he had sounded, the same as what a lot of people have?
I don't claim to know the precise route that Sam took. And actually, I hate him. I really do, because anybody that flies for a living and has a boat and doesn't even own a house and doesn't have to cut the lawn and just cruises around the Caribbean and all kinds of other places with his wife, that's a really bad guy. No, seriously, I'm just kidding.
Seems like he should be the new poster child for why you should get into aviation journalism to me.
That's an interesting point. But of course, one of the things about the columnists is that almost all of them came to be by knowing somebody. There was a fellow that used to be at Flying a long time ago that kind of got me started in writing at, I think I mentioned about the same time the airline went under, a fellow named Gordon Baxter. Bax used to write a column at Flying called Backseat, and it was very down home. So he was a good guy, and he actually, we ended up connecting one time, and he actually came to stay at my house for a weekend. And he was the funniest guy I ever met. One of the first things he said when he walked in the door was, "Do you mind if I take my shoes off?" And I said, "No, go ahead." And about 5 minutes later, he said, "Do you mind if I take my socks off too?" And I said, "No, whatever you want, man, And but it was really funny how we kind of got to know each other, and we started talking about writing because he was a famous guy. I mean, he was in Flying every month. I'd been reading him for years, and now the guy was sitting in my living room, and I think I must have said something like something in awe or something really inane like that. And he said, "Oh, you could do this." I said, "Oh God, I couldn't do what you do." But he said, "Well, why don't you try?" And I did. Oh, maybe 6 months later, and I sent something off to Flying because I knew Bax, and he gave me an email of some editor, and I sent it to their. I learned about Flying from that column that they do every month, where some jackass pilot admits something really stupid that they did, and lived to tell the tale. What I think is interesting is that I think the number of I Laugh columns is up to close to 1,000. There are at least 1,000 people out there that wrote well enough to be able to tell the story about something that they did in aviation in a way that people found it interesting enough to read. Now, how many of them, carried through and continued doing that kind of work? I don't know. For all I know, maybe Sam was one of those people. You have to start somewhere. And if you don't know somebody at a magazine, you have to go where they are. So if you're at the NBAA convention, which moves between Orlando and Vegas every year, you can find the media rooms. All the magazines have a little cubby hole there where they keep 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 writers that are either on staff or have showed up for the show to cover the show. I mean, Aviation Week is there, Plane and Pilot, Flying, AOPA Pilot, Twin Turbine. I mean, you name it, they're there. I mean, so if I really wanted to do this, I might say, you know what, I'm going to spend a couple of $100 to get a ticket to go to the show and get in, and I'm going to go find some of those people. And I'm going to talk to them and say, hey, I want to do this. I doubt seriously anybody is going to say, go away, kid. I don't believe that at all. But we never see that kind of thing.
Well, it's an interesting question then. I mean, I know in some industries, if you're new and there's sort of a master at work, a lot of times you have to be like, hey, can you show me how to do this? And no, go get me a coffee. What would be the response, Is
True.
Journalism like that?
Well, I can't claim to be a master strategist when it comes to a newsroom because I never worked full-time at a newspaper. I've worked now full-time for a magazine, and I can tell you it's a very different life from being a freelancer where you're kind of pitching your own stories. And that's one of the things about being a freelancer that a lot of people don't like. You're not tied to any one magazine, but not only are you the writer and researcher, you're the marketer. You've got to go out there and find the outlets, pitch them the story, and get the chunk of business before you can actually do the writing. And that's another part of this that people don't like. They just don't want to work that hard. A tough call, but again, in the newsroom, I wish I could say that every place I've ever worked had a great mentoring. But I mean, when I was in charter, I always thought that when I was in the left seat, I was a captain, but my secondary job was to train that person in the right seat to become a captain too one of these days. There are a lot of pilots that don't think like that. Their job is to go start the airplane, go from here to there, come home and leave. I'm sure that's true in every job. So you got to be persistent, but if what you're doing isn't getting you anywhere, then you need to say, maybe I'm in the wrong job, or maybe I'm going about this the wrong way. But again, that's the curiosity part, I think, that's important, because if you just say, well, I'm just going to sit here because eventually they'll realize how valuable I am. You could be there a long time.
Yeah, it sounds like you have to have really quite a hustle to make it in the industry.
I think you almost have to have hustle to make it in any industry. I mean, you can get a job. I think there are certainly people that can get jobs. I don't think that's an issue at all. But can you get the kind of job that you want? Can you progress the way that you'd like? Some people can, some people can't. And again, the question is why? And if you're not getting what you want, then you better rethink your strategy. It's what I've learned in my life is that nobody gives you anything. It's hard enough when you really go out and try to grab it. Pilots trying to build time. I went through this at a career fair a few months ago where somebody said, well, I've got a commercial and I was going to get my flight instructor's rating. I guess I have to because what am I going to do to get to 1,500 hours? I mean, I don't know what I could do, and could do it the same way I did it. You claw for it. I mean, I did get a flight instructor's rating, but I also wandered around airports. I met people. I offered to help keep their airplanes up if they'd let me sit in the right seat. I didn't even care if I got paid, even in airplanes that didn't need a second pilot, just so I could experience the world. And you would be surprised at how many people said, yeah, sure, come on along. But you had to ask. And not everybody said yes. But again, I think people that are thinking about being professional pilots, now that we have this 1,500-hour ATP rule on the air carrier side, that say, oh, what will I do? How will I ever get that time? Go be a carpenter or something, because it's never going to happen. Nobody's going to give it to you. And I think personally, I get a little peeved at people that went through school and kind of have this coming. I want to be an airline pilot, but I don't want to do it in 5 or 6 or 8 years. I want to do it now. Okay, well then go reinvent a new way to do that. Maybe that's the attitude thing that we have seen change with people over the years. Probably that parents of my generation, probably me included, have done with kids, that to make them think that if you don't get it right now, it's not worth having. And it takes time. And again, a lot of people don't want to spend the time.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, sounds like if somebody really, 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 really wants it and they're willing to put in the work, then they can get it. But
it's not easy. It's not. But it's not easy being a pilot either. It's not easy being an airline pilot.
Well, it's the old saying, right? If it's cheap and easy, everyone would do it.
Yeah, it's true. That's very true. So what do you want to be when you grow up?
And that's a great place to leave a to be continued. So if you're thinking you have the hustle for something like that, I'm excited for you. So as you leave the podcast today and you go about your aviation endeavors, whatever they might be, I want you to think about how you're going to fit into this bigger picture and how the skills you have now can be applied to something else. And most importantly, what you're going to have in your back pocket in case things don't go according to plan. Because weird stuff happens. I mean, people lose medicals, airlines go out of business. Maybe the government shuts down and you don't get paid for a month. Who knows? So hopefully something you've heard today will help you guide you towards your goals, or maybe even help you set some new ones. And if you want to share yours or talk about them more, go to podcastingonaplane.com where you can contact me and record feedback, subscribe, catch up on past episodes, and maybe even share the show with a friend. Because just like everything else in this industry, a personal recommendation can break right through those high barriers to entry and get you where you need to be. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. Your frequency change is approved until next time, and report back on this frequency for the next episode. Good day. The Podcasting on a Plane podcast is presented for entertainment purposes only. My comments and those of my guests, the website's content, and any of the social media, etc. are not part of my official responsibility as a controller or an FAA employee. The views and opinions you hear on the podcast are mine and those of my guests, and not necessarily that of the FAA. There is no nexus between Podcasting on a Plane and the FAA. Also, while I am a CFI, I'm not your CFI. Nor am I your mechanic, your doctor, your shrink, or your spouse. This podcast is presented for entertainment, camaraderie, and fun, but is in no way, shape, or form professional advice. It's not legal counsel, and it's definitely not flight instruction. If you are in need of professional advice, get some from somewhere more appropriate than a podcast, no matter how good this one may be.